Yeah, I think it's already. I'm already doing it. If you can check, it's.
Okay, let's see.
Is that from? I think that's from my. The signal is from my. Yeah, I think it's already. I'm already doing it. If you can check.
Yeah. I'm checking it now. Okay, let's see. Yeah.
I think that's feedback. That's
Looks
feedback.
fine.
We got to kill that.
Yeah, I muted.
Is the voice all right?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, should be fine. All right, so let's get started. Can you guys hear me? All right.
Loud and clear.
Shall I start recording?
Oh yeah, that would be also great.
But you are the host, I think.
Okay, I'll give you the host to you. Okay, so let's get started. I'm now sharing the screen.
Yep.
All right. All right. So today we are going to do AMCS conference recap session by Ariel and Alex being the speaker. So please go ahead and then start. Who wants to start? Maybe should I just introduce you guys first? So Alex is a professor in Vanderbilt University and working on mainly on monkey physiology, but interested in consciousness, and has been doing lots of psychophysics work as well. And Ariel is a postdoc in our lab and working on color perception and similarity rating and mathematical foundation of qualia structure. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I can take a start here. So I think the first thing I wanted to say is I wanted to congratulate the organizers of the conference. So Ariel and I just had a brief chat. We both agreed that it was a fantastic conference. I had high hopes for the conference, and it turned out to come true. It was a true highlight of my year, and that includes, having a baby. So it was definitely a really good conference.
Congratulations! Yeah.
So what do you think, Ariel?
Yeah, I agree. I think so. I want to acknowledge, particularly because the organizers originally wanted to run an in-person conference and were unable to do so due to COVID and Delta strain. And also the organization is very young, so the association has only just set themselves up. These are some of the organizers for the conference and the board members, the ones I've highlighted in blue, so Johannes, Jonathan, and Robin. They've clearly just done an extraordinary amount of work in a fairly short space of time trying to get this all to work, and it also ran as smoothly as possible. So there were still like internet connection issues and some things, but it's one of the smoothest online things I've seen work. So it's a good example of how I imagine a very large number of conferences will be running in the future forwards. So yeah, just think they've done a good job. The second slide, I also just wanted to highlight the difference between like why this as opposed to other conferences. So this conference was specifically about mathematical approaches to studying consciousness. And there's two other conferences that look into consciousness that I'm aware of. So there's the ASSC, which as far as I'm aware is more focused around the philosophy and neuroscience and psychology side, with less of an emphasis on the mathematical formula frameworks or like physics input. And then there's I've been to one ASSC, but then there's also the Science for Consciousness conference, which I've never been to, but seems to be much broader in its scope. But maybe Alex or Now, who've actually been to maybe these others, would have a comment. I also am not sure if there's any other conferences in contrast that I've missed or that exist. Now you're muted if you tried to say something.
Yeah, Alex, do you want to say?
Well, it's funny because I wanted to go, we didn't coordinate, but I had the exact same list of talking points. So I think it's great to hand over. Yeah, so I think I also, when the conference came into being, I did not know where it would fit into the landscape. And I think it's really worth emphasizing that this was a conference on the mathematical study of consciousness, and it sees itself as a complement to the conferences that are for the scientific study of consciousness. And I noticed that there was a clear need for a mathematical consciousness conference, because at the beginning of the conference, it was announced that there were 400 people registered. And so that's pretty much as we're at the last ASSC meeting. And so I counted about 100 people in the initial session, and it more or less held constant across the next couple of days, if you look how things split. And just as another example that this might have been really needed and fit, was that Carl Friston, I think who a lot of people know, one of the greats in the field, gave a talk. He gave the keynote lecture of the conference, and he said that was his first conscious conference. So I thought that was worth pointing out as well.
Also, on that note, I saw that he didn't just give a talk, he actually stuck around a bit. I saw him pop up on the Zoom calls on other days as well. So that was kind of nice to see some engagement with people who might not necessarily have been around.
Yeah, that's interesting. We maybe there is a TWCF adversarial collaboration on the this free energy kind of stuff and so on. So maybe that's one of the reasons. Okay, so shall we go on about the highlight of the day one? Is there anything about day one you wanted to make sure you want to comment?
Well, yeah, actually, more generally, I wanted to say what really stuck out to me, what made that conference so great, was the use of Gather Town. So I know that's something that now you've been doing a lot as well. I think that the brilliant move at the conference was to have moderated discussions. So people were in Gather Town and they're walking around, and it led to what I've seen before, that I'm actually a quite shy person. So I don't know who to approach. I feel a little bit uncomfortable, but there were pre-seated tables. And then there was interactive voting using Slido in terms of 3 topics that were discussed at each point in time. And you could choose one of the 3 most highlighted topics and sit at a table, and 2 people would take the lead. One person would moderate the discussion, and a second person would take notes. And I have to say that the people that moderated the discussion did a superb job, an absolutely fantastic job, making sure that pretty much everybody had the same time talking, and at the same time that there was a natural flow to the discussion. So it really managed something that I think is so hard, which in these times that we get a little bit the feeling of an actual conference where we can sit together and not just listen to a talk and have 5 minutes for questions, but can discuss a little more. What was your experience with that, Ariel?
Yeah, I thought it was good. I also thought it was quite good that these discussion sessions were interspersed amongst the talks, both the invited talks and the contributed talks, because it was quite helpful to have people talk and then to have a small conversation of maybe between like 8 and 10 people typically, where you got to like lay into them as to like what was actually going on and what the motivations were and what the issues were and those sorts of things. So I found it very helpful, because often I'd come along and I'd be like, I didn't really understand this, and this, and they'd talk me through it. Just in this example there, so there were 3 different topics for each discussion group, as Alex just mentioned. And the first one I went to was on attempts to classify models of consciousness, because basically there was a quite broad acknowledgement that it's quite hard to get into the space of understanding all the different theories and frameworks that are out there. And like that was just an example of quite a helpful discussion. And there were two papers that came up as a discussion of that. One is a recent one in Neuroscience of Consciousness, which is a paper on multidimensional spaces to describe consciousness, which there were three authors. I think one of the authors was Robert Prentner, who was one of the organizers, and then Camillo Signorelli, and then someone else who I have forgotten. Apologies to you if you hear this. But that was quite a helpful paper at describing the space of possible theories. And then another one was a Durick et al. Hard criteria for empirical theories of consciousness, which I haven't read properly yet, so I can't talk through. But it was just useful because Camillo, one of the authors, was there, and we just like talked to him about how he'd structured the space of models of consciousness. So yeah, that's all on day one in particular. I could talk about some of the particular talks, but that might be a little bit too much detail. So I'll hand back to Alex.
Yeah, maybe we should probably go through the sort of the highlight first, picking up the sort of the global potential interest of the topic of the discussion. Ariel, maybe we should talk about it later, but we can probably implement something like you guys did in our grant meeting or other types of the gather meeting. I found what Alex said very interesting, really. Okay, yeah. So let's move on. Day two.
Well, actually, two more things I wanted to add real quick to day one. One is that what Ariel said, and I know this is very general, but the other thing I really thought why these discussions were great was that there was a lot of emphasis on trying to get everybody on the same page and at the same board. And there were other discussions that we'll probably talk about later that I was happy that people helped to explain things to me a little bit because a lot of that, I'm new to that myself. I just wanted to real quick talk about Carl Friston's talk real fast as well. So one thing that I noticed in general about the conference is that I think that the ASSC crowd has gone through a little bit more of distinctions in terms of what is meant by consciousness. And so in particular, I think that NetBlock's distinction between A and P consciousness has proved very helpful in making sure that people don't talk past each other, meaning different things about consciousness. And so that's something that I vaguely sense sometimes at that conference as well, that for some people, consciousness is maybe something more akin to mind, and it's closer to the functional side. And to other people, it's purely the phenomenal. And so I think that clarifying that can help sometimes with potential misunderstandings. And my impression was that what Carl talked about was more leaning to the functional side. So it was a talk about consciousness, but incorporating maybe things that are more cognitive maybe as well. And so that was brought up towards the end, and he was saying that he's part of the Templeton World Grant. And he talked a little bit about qualia, and so that's why I noticed that he himself also seems to think that phenomenal is probably distinct from most of what he talked about in terms of the free energy model. So I thought that was noteworthy, in particular because there are debates about different models of consciousness, and I think at first we would have to find out exactly what do we mean by consciousness. Are you talking about something more that's akin to mind, or are you thinking about something more that's close to phenomenology?
On that note, I think the difference between ASSC or Tucson is that because this is very young conference, they didn't do it, especially for the first one, but ASSC and Tucson has 1 day or 2 of the tutorial days, right? And there, entire one morning of 3 hours and 3 hours of the afternoon is dedicated for those people who are paying to participate in this, tutorial to basically learn some kind of really focused topic of the basics and make them up to sort of the discussion and the current status of the study. And without doing that, I can totally imagine that would be happening. And my guess is that this conference will benefit a lot, really a lot from that kind of thing, right? Like especially the category theory or dynamics or complexity theory and IAT, all of these probably require 3 hours of the introduction, really. And that video itself will be very useful in the future, possibly.
Yeah, and so interestingly enough, one of the other great things that the organizers did was at the end of the conference, they had a huge session for feedback. And that was exactly one of the pieces of feedback that came over, that this idea of workshops that ASSC is using, that might be worth doing. And yeah, so yeah, I would love to learn more about category theory this way.
I see. Okay, shall we go to day 2?
Yeah, so stuff that was on day 2. So there was a series of talks. One of those was more relevant to us, so we can discuss that later. I guess the only comment here was there were quite a few talks on using category theory approaches for studying consciousness in different ways, shapes, or form. It seems to be quite a popular approach. And so, yeah, that was just interesting to see, because I wasn't aware of how many different people were exploring its use to get at these topics. And what else? One of the other interesting talks on this day was, I guess there were several, like, no offense to any of the particular speakers, but of talks I found particularly interesting. One was a talk by Johannes Kleiner, who's the chairman, one of the organizers of the conference, on a no-go theorem for the closure of the physical. So as far as I'm aware, and I'm not a physicist, a no-go theorem is a theorem that states that it will be impossible to show something, or like you won't be able to see some sort of phenomenon. So it's not when you prove the existence of something, but it's where you prove that something is impossible to, I don't know whether it's like like it doesn't exist, or it's just impossible to observe, or something along those lines. But if there are any physicists that can give me a better description. But anyway, the point of the talk was, he was talking about a recent preprint of his with a co-author, Hartman, where they have a formal proof that any two theories of consciousness that agree on the fact that there is causal closure of the physical, which means that they agree on all of like the physical descriptions of the world, must be like empirically indistinguishable from each other. So it means that, let's say if you had a theory like IIT and global neuronal workspace theory, and they agreed always on like what all the different recordings you could make from brains of creatures that were putatively conscious were, then empirically it would be impossible to distinguish between the two. And then Kleiner makes the claim that that means that certain theories of consciousness are unscientific because they're empirically indistinguishable from each other. And there's a lot of different implications and different ways to think about the talk, because on the one hand, you can say it's a somewhat trivial finding, because like the easiest way for something to be not agree with closure of the physical is just that it's wrong, and it makes the wrong predictions about like what brain activity you would expect. But another way in which you can interpret it is essentially it's a formal proof for the like possibility of p-zombies or philosophical zombies if you're only looking from like at physical data or empirical data. And basically it really like, it triggered a lot of debate because made a lot of people very uncomfortable. And that was kind of fun as well. And then Larissa's talk.
Oh, wait, about
sorry.
that, sorry.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess it speaks probably directly about the Chalmers position, right? And but before going that, you know, among the audience here right now or participants, is there anybody who can explain this no-go theorem from a physics point of view? Otherwise, we can talk about that. Yeah, we don't have it. So, what was the sort of the reaction from the Chalmers kind of camp?
I actually think the main reaction was just one of a bit of confusion, because I think most people weren't familiar with the no-go terminology and the implications of the paper. So I actually had to go read the paper before I understood it properly afterwards. So yeah, unfortunately, that was not so good because it was only a 20-minute talk and it covered quite a few different concepts.
I see. Okay. All right, then Is there anything to add, Alex, or should we just go to next one from Ariel? Or
I also thought that this was a really strong day for the conference. Well, just a few small remarks. One is that the prior talks about category theory, they're not using category theory in a similar way that I understand you are proposing, in a way that would provide a functor to link the physical substrate to the mental qualia. That they're using category theory though in relationship to consciousness, but I'm still making my way through that. But a lot of it was based on certain kinds of Buddhism. So it was very heavy stuff, and then ensuing to that was a discussion in terms of what is category theory useful for, and does it have any place in consciousness, maybe also outside of that approach. So that was quite interesting, but honestly way above my head. So I'd love to learn more about that. And I also understood Johannes' talk slightly different, but I haven't read the paper, so I'll defer to what Ariel said. I sensed in there a little bit what Ariel said, that that the point is basically that was a little bit more my understanding, that like if we can explain the physical, then a consciousness theory wouldn't be adding much to that, unless you assume that it might violate the closure of physics. So what I see in there again is a little bit a functionalistic argument that that we might not be able to get at the pure phenomenal if it is epiphenomenal. So very interesting. And then I think Larissa's talk was a little bit of a response to that, but I'll let Ariel talk about it.
So Larissa's talk
before going to that, maybe I can just add a little bit of category theory. So just a bit of the self-advertisement is that our paper is going to be out most likely this week or next week, and that's going to probably be the first one to talk about the real category theory application on the phenomenal consciousness. And that's before them, including our previous paper, it wasn't really clear how we can apply this into sort of the real either neuroscientific or psychophysics or phenomenology side. And I know that the Camilo's talk or Quan Long's kind of approach is like capturing some kind of ideas in Buddhism to sort of a vague mathematical kind of framework. And the category theory is so good at capturing these vague ideas, and that's probably one of the reasons why many people are excited about these kind of things. But same thing has happened in other fields. Category theory is so flexible and so promising in many ways that the other mathematical theory couldn't actually treat, like topology or shape or change of the shape or change of the network and so on. Many people find it kind of promising, but to implement that really, it's not that easy for the people who understand the concept side, right? So you definitely want to work with the mathematicians. But as far as I know, the Oxford group is pretty much isolated themselves from the real empirical scientists who can understand these kind of concepts or apply these concepts to or with this mathematical tools. And that's probably advantage that we have. Like, I've been working with these theories, to, in a sense, educate them, the empirical side, and then I learn from them the theoretical side. So I think that will probably take some time for them to develop.
I think, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add something on this. And one of the issues that actually exposed to about this category theory is sometimes people actually misclassify, misunderstand in terms of a database categorization, and then they apply it in that sense, which makes issues too complicated. And then you cannot really actually have a foundation, as like Chitia was just mentioning, that you cannot actually build on the proper foundation based on which you can further develop the concepts of how the grouping happens, how the functors will be defined on the top of those groups and things like that. And mostly they just fall into the database formation and the database science, which is quite, I don't really see there is going to be any benefits of doing it that way and applying it that way, but yeah.
Yeah, the database is actually also related to category theory. We are probably going to write some paper along this line, but it's another theory that is also related to category theory and database theory, which is a pre-sheaf and sheaf theory. And these are, in a sense, I think it's probably related to, or it's a very good tool to, in a sense, sort of the theoretically deal with the phenomenal and access consciousness in some way. But I'm not sure what kind of misunderstanding they had. But is it something like a basic terminology kind of confusion, like category and groups are just misunderstood to mean something else?
Well, I think what happened was, like, for instance, from a very personal experience that they had, there was this group that I was working with, and they wanted to apply the category theory in the genetics and the diseases. And then when we started talking about, so, okay, how we are going to be actually introducing the groups in here, how we are going to be actually applying, whether there are groups actually formed in here, and what is the equivalences that we're going to be actually defining, based on which then you can have the groups and then the functors operating on them. Eventually it turned out to be some sort of, what they were actually considering was some sort of the relational, very simple relational databases, other than actually going into forming the categories, forming the groups based on those categories, forming the functors that are operational between the different categories that can bring them together, and things like this. So basically the transition and the translation between the different groups and the categories. And of course, as you just mentioned, these are very, very helpful and very, very useful. But then most probably, if you're going to be just thinking about at the very basic level of relational databases, probably you won't need to go that deep into the direction of the category theory per se.
I see. Okay, I think I got what you mean, but maybe we can talk about this kind of thing later.
Sure.
All right, let's move on. So about Larissa's talk, Alex or Ariel?
Yeah, just briefly, it was kind of a fun response to some of the other talks. So Larissa essentially proposed, it was a talk centered around a thought experiment, where it was a modification of the classic Chinese room thought experiment by John Searle, which is, the idea is, for those who don't know, you've got a person who speaks English, they're in a room, they have instructions fed into the room in Chinese, and they have to give output in Chinese. And they don't themselves speak Chinese, but they just have a big lookup table where, like, they see the symbols, they find the appropriate response, and then they output the symbols. And the question that's often asked is like, well, does the room speak Chinese or understand Chinese in some sort? And you get different responses. So Larissa's variant on this, and she had a name for it, which I've forgotten, and Alex might remember, was you have 3 people instead of 1 person in a room. I think it was called the Greek room. And the first person speaks Greek. The second person speaks, how does it go? No, I think there's 2 bilingual people and there's 1 monolingual people. So the input person is bilingual Greek-English and the output person is bilingual Greek-English, but the person in the middle only speaks English. And the room gets fed in a question in Greek, but the first person doesn't answer the question. They just translate it and hand it to the second person. The second person in English answers the question and gives it to the third person. And the third person translates it back into Greek and then outputs it out the end. And you can ask the same question as with the Chinese room, which is like, does the room understand Greek in some sense? And behaviorally, it absolutely looks like the room understands Greek. And it looks like it's behaving as like one particular like consciousness that is behaviorally understanding Greek. But Larissa thinks that that's absurd because like clearly there's 3 different consciousnesses, not just a single consciousness within the room. And the only way you could understand that is by looking at the causal structure, i.e. the fact that there's 3 brains in the room. And that's essentially an argument in favor of causal structure that she was making. I'm not sure it was quite as formally rigorous to make everyone happy who would have been there, but it was a fun thought experiment to be exploring.
Yeah, and what I didn't know, I knew that Larissa has a great blog, consciousnessrealist.com. I did not know that she had a post on that already. So I posted it on the sideline. So yeah, she calls it the Greek cave. I thought it was great. My understanding was that it was a semi-formal answer to the debate that has unfolded, no pun intended, with the unfolding argument. So the question, if you have integrated information theory, that you could come up with a system that is functionally identical, but it wouldn't have the properties that IIT is saying require consciousness. And so basically, it's a more sophisticated P-zombie argument, basically, that if you just look at behavior, if you just look at function, then yes, integrated information theory would say that that doesn't get you there. There's more, and I think there's a lot of debate around, is that scientific or no? And so Larissa's argument here is that if you just look at behavior, if you just look at function, and you're trying to understand what is going on here, then how would you explain that? And in particular, what I find striking is that the function is the same as the Chinese room, but here you now have three separate parts of consciousness that are contributing that. So some of the Chinese room arguments go out of the window, but it clearly also shows you that what goes on inside the Chinese room or the Greek cave seems to matter. It seems to matter how the function comes about. It's not just about the function, it is how it comes about. And so that I thought was a really great point to make, especially since, as I said, I think it was a re-emerging topic in discussions at the conference, that it's a big stepping stone for a lot of people, that to say that if we're just measuring behavior, we're just looking at function, we're not going to get maybe at some of these things that those of us who believe in IIT believe in.
Okay. All right, that's great. And then let's move on for the interest of time. So the next slide is about this.
Yeah, this is a funny 30-second interlude, which is just, I was very glad I gave my talk on day one, because on the late afternoon, evening of day three, I found out my partner, who's a GP, had been exposed to COVID and was going to be forced into quarantine. I had about an hour to get out of the house, or I also would have been locked into quarantine for 2 weeks.
Oh.
So I spent the third evening of the conference attending from outside in a hastily set up like tarpaulin tent sort of thing with a Wi-Fi connection so that I could still go, but without getting rained on. But this is the joy of virtual conferences, is you can attend from anywhere, even under a tarp in the outside environment. But it was pretty funny. I now have found a place to live though, so I'm talking to you from inside a building.
Okay, great.
It was just funny.
Congratulations. Okay, so day three.
Yeah. So this was an example, I thought, just briefly, of like a few different talks with like very different assumptions behind what the phenomena we were studying were and how to go about doing so. So there was talk from Eva Jablonka, who I'm not exactly sure. She seems to have done quite a few different things, but I think her main background is in biology, who was giving a talk about what she thought were sufficient behavioral conditions for identifying a species as having consciousness, and the evolution of like species that met those particular conditions. But what I found interesting essentially is that it very much involved consciousness being defined from a functionalist perspective initially, or at least that was my impression of what she was saying. And then it was approached from less from a mathematical background from then onwards, and much more from just the like identifying behavior and going through the evolution. And it was just very easy to imagine other people who have a different view, not really like even finding the premise of the talk particularly appealing and then taking issue with a lot of it. And it was just interesting that this wasn't exactly acknowledged throughout the talk. So it's an example of people kind of talking past each other. I don't know if Alex had any other comments on that.
I actually had to miss that day because I was teaching. So I very much look forward to a lot of these talks get posted. I'm very interested in these, but yeah, that's a day I almost completely missed, unfortunately.
All right, I'll talk briefly through the other talks then. So then Shimon Edelman, who attended the whole conference, he gave a different talk where he essentially was identifying consciousness with, I'm going to get this wrong, but essentially he defined conscious things as systems that had any sort of basic feedback mechanisms in an almost panpsychist way, where like, I think according to him, essentially a thermostat or other sorts of like extremely basic systems that perform some sort of like what he terms auto-diagnosis or like sort of feedback on themselves and the system they're embedded in would be conscious. And then he talks through like the progression of more and more complicated systems. And there was a little bit more acknowledgement of the assumptions that were going on in that. But again, it was a talk that was motivated from like potentially a very different starting point and with very different assumptions to what other people were engaged in. But that's
yeah, just a quick question. So this term diagnosis, is it meant to be kind of a similar to metacognition like framework, or more like, you know, just a connection, like a recurrence or IIT feedback or something like that?
I think he means it more in the recurrent feedback sense, but I don't want to be held to that without having read through the paper on that. It possibly meant a little bit of both. It seemed to be both about feedback, but also about like self, even if it's not conscious, like self information in some sense.
I see. Okay.
So I'd have to check. He also, and I should acknowledge, also talked a lot about the value of psychological experimentation and multidimensional scaling approaches and similarity style approaches to studying consciousness as well.
Yeah, he recently gave a talk on the pain from that kind of perspective, right?
Yeah.
Did you watch that? Yeah.
No, I haven't watched the talk, but I just remembered an important part of his talk. So I think there was, hold on, I'm just going to find my notes very briefly because it was an important distinction he made. Yeah, so he essentially had two different basic aspects of phenomenal awareness that he was interested in. And the primary one were, he termed them feelings, which is probably related to the pain talk, which I haven't seen yet, which are things like valence or affect or pain, which, what did he term them as? As outcome predictive aspects of discernible. And these were, as opposed to discernibles, which he thought were like the fundamental thing in consciousness, which were necessary byproducts of intrinsic auto-diagnosis. And then he built everything up from the dynamics of these feelings and discernibles. But I think I'd have to read the paper to get more into detail as to how it differed from other approaches.
Okay. All right, let's go to then David.
Yeah, so Chalmers spoke about, some of you may have seen his previous talk before, but it was essentially an overview of the developments in his ongoing paper with Kelvin McQueen about trying to understand consciousness in the context of the collapse of the wave function, and whether consciousness can somehow be affecting the collapse of the wave function. And it was quite funny because he himself acknowledged that he's not really sure, or at least my impression of his talk is he's not really sure if he actually believes in this at all, and more he's just exploring the idea of like, maybe there's some interaction between consciousness and wave function collapse, and thinks it's worth rigorously exploring what can happen. And essentially his talk was based on how he and Kelvin have tried to grab the quantum formulation of IIT that was recently, I think, published at least as a preprint by Johannes Kleiner, and maybe Kelvin as well was involved. I lose track. And then they try to work through what predictions that would make about what systems may or may not be conscious. And then there's a lot of details I didn't quite understand. But in the end, they actually end up with various different experiments that could potentially falsify whether consciousness and wave function collapse are associated with each other. And I think it turns out there's particular kinds of quantum computing experiments where if you could set up a particular quantum computing experiment where you would have qubits that were like somehow had non-zero phi in an IIT sense, that should be performing wave function collapse and would prevent particular kinds of quantum computing from happening if they were interacting with consciousness. But if they weren't interacting with consciousness, then they wouldn't be affecting it. So that's, I think, what he wanted to get across, that they were finally almost ready to publish the paper with those sorts of implications.
I mean, there are lots of already YouTube videos and also paper preprint available on this, so maybe we can skip further. All right, and then Susanna, do you
I was
have
a
anything
little
to say? Yeah.
Yeah, it was the middle of the. I was like 4 o'clock in the morning by then. I was a bit out of it. It was something about. No, I can't. People should watch the talk.
Also, it's probably irrelevant to consciousness, I think, from the title, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You were sitting outside in the rain.
Yeah. Okay. So the last day, Alex, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, so again, it was great that day that there was a lot of room for discussion. I think I was also part of the discussion on consciousness versus temperature, which was very interesting. I think it came up to the conference a couple of times. And I was aware of that topic from talks that Anil Seth gave actually many years ago at that workshop that you organized now at Cosine, and the book Measuring Temperature. And my recollection was that back then his argument was that we can study consciousness without knowing exactly what it is, A, and then B, that maybe a fruitful way into the study of consciousness, given that we don't know what it is to first measure it or come up with a way of measuring it and drawing parallels to the discovery of temperature or the science of temperature. And so the point of Johannes Kleiner and other people was that there are very strict limits to using that metaphor when it comes to consciousness. So maybe Ariel can talk more about that, but yeah, it seems logical in that consciousness involves qualia and involves the heart problem, and those are not issues that plague the research of temperature.
Yeah, it led pretty naturally into the second discussion session on emergence.
But before then can I ask a quick question? So it's nothing about whether the generation of the experience involves any kind of the energy or whatsoever.
No. It was about the analogy only.
I seriously think, this is something that the physicists really should think about it very, very, carefully. And it's an interesting kind of question. I once had this discussion with I think it was a quantum information theorist or somebody along the thermodynamics and dynamics and so on. But it's really weird that everything is really completely closed in physics, including the experience. And some of the physicists said that if it's just changing from one state to the other, when we move from one conscious experience to the another, and then overall energy state or temperature or whatever, everything included, may be preserved. But if it goes completely out, or if it changes from nothing to something, then there has to be some kind of relevant change in energy budget or temperature or whatever, everything included in physics. But it's nothing along this line. Yeah,
that would be quite a separate discussion. This was just about exploring the analogy, as Alex was doing, between consciousness.
But there were some physicists, right, in the audience.
Yeah, well, so Sean, there's quite a few actually. So I mean, Johannes Kleiner, Sean Tal, Kobe Kremnitzer, I think, and Robin Lorenz. I'm not sure if they're theoretical physicists as well as mathematicians, but they certainly were all very informed about the physics. And I'm sure there were other physicists, or at least theoretical physics informed people attending the talk.
It's going to be very difficult to measure in any case, but yeah, okay. All right, then let's go to emergence.
Well, so the two, in my impression, certainly, it was essentially a continuum of the same discussion, where it was a question of, with temperature, we, on the one hand, we like knew temperature in that we could measure it long before we understood the microphysical properties that led to temperature, being the mean, I'm not a physicist, so I might mess this up, but like the mean energy of the particles and the mean kinetic energy of the particles. And then like we were able to bridge from the temperature measurements on a like high level macro scale and the microphysical level thermodynamics, where it was very unclear whether or not the same thing existed with consciousness. And now we're talking about emergence, where it's unclear whether or not you can predict or explain consciousness just by looking at the microphysical neuronal interactions or atomic states or those sorts of things, or whether something emerges out of them. And there was also a discussion of the difference between weak emergence, which is the sense that it's not that there's new stuff that happens when you get to the macro scale. It's just that the behavior and the properties are like much easier to describe. So you can think of describing weather phenomena, or actually life is, I think, the classical example used, where you could make the argument that like, well, it's just chemistry in the end, but like it's really much easier to describe it in the sense of what life forms do. So there was debate whether consciousness is a form of weak emergence or whether it's more like strong emergence, which is the sense that like, no, there's actually something new happening now that you're at this higher level scale that cannot just be reduced down to the interaction between the low level properties. There was also a little bit of a debate around what it even means to like capture the low level properties. So some people took issue with the fact that often when we look at the low level properties, people leave out the relationships between low level items and their interactions. And they think that if you talk properly about the interactions between like the microphysical components, then there's no room for emergence to happen as well. And I might leave it there because I'm certainly not an expert on emergence. So maybe Alex understands this stuff better.
I thought that was great. Yeah. So what I took away from that is that it was yet another discussion where there was surprisingly amount of work on definitions and people realizing that they mean different things. And yeah, it was great because I think that that's what discussions are really useful for. And if you just have a series of talks, then you can't work these things out. So that's exactly why I thought this conference was great. And I hope that maybe some of the people that are watching are from the conference and could maybe also join discussions here on this YouTube channel, because I would like to see some of these discussions continue. There were interesting points that I hadn't thought about before in terms of not just emergence, but also how something that emerges and then maybe exists on a higher level that doesn't exist on the constituent parts could then have causal power over the constituent parts. So that was something that I never figured out how that could be, but talk about how a system could constrain the relations or the degrees of freedom on the lower levels, depending on its organization. And so quite a bit of interesting thought in that discussion.
So is that Mateo's paper published in Nature Neuroscience?
So yeah, there's a few papers that bear on that. So one is Mateo's paper, as you said, on Nature Neuroscience. The other papers that came up were, there's a paper by a physicist. I think his name is Marcus Luker or Luma. I can check that in a second, but the link's on the slides, which is trying to, I think the paper title's Observer States the Physics, where he starts with subjective measurements. Yeah,
Marcus Mueller?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
So that was one paper relating to emergence. Another one was by Fernando Rosas, who was also attending the conference. And then another one that was discussed, but I haven't linked there, was by Varela, and it's a 2001 Trends in Cognitive Science paper by Varela and someone else who I've also forgotten that was talking about what Alex was just talking about, the like downwards versus upwards causation in constraints. So all of those would be relevant to anyone interested.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And anything else about day 4? That's fine. Otherwise,
yeah, not from me. Otherwise, I just have general comments.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. Good.
Yeah, so maybe I'll briefly run through it. So just a few general comments. We've already touched on some of these. So what I found quite useful about the conference is it seems that when people start trying to formalize these ideas and theories of consciousness in mathematical frameworks, it does become easier to understand the assumptions that people are using and what assumptions they're making. It's perhaps not as clear in this, it wasn't as clear in this conference as it might have been at the ASSC, of the different backgrounds that people were coming from and the different philosophical backgrounds. But even still, like there were some good examples, like there was one talk from someone advocating functionalism and a few other talks from people advocating identity theories or causal structure theories. And it seemed to me to be a lot easier for people to engage with each other and criticize each other when they were trying to develop these mathematical formalizations of the assumptions. And there was definitely a consensus that it should be more common when people are publishing papers for these assumptions to be spelled out extremely explicitly and ideally in some succinct way to make it easier for readers to understand. Then a second point related to that, which is despite the fact that these assumptions are important, there's absolutely no consensus or clarity on the underlying assumptions. Where, for example, the talk I gave was about trying to understand consciousness through its relational properties and maybe identify consciousness with relational properties between phenomenal states. And I certainly got both like strong agreement and strong pushback on that viewpoint from different people at the conference. And then Johannes's talk, which we've already talked about, bared on that as well. I might let Alex make some comments if he has any on this or other things.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I think we strongly agree. I really like the diversity of thought that was there, but I think that it definitely would be helpful for the crowd as a whole to work through some of the issues that have already been done in the field. So that, some talks when they're about consciousness, but they involve working memory or attention, I think it'd be helpful to fill in about what is known empirically, for example, about the relationship of these things. So that's why I think that if they implement those workshops next year, I think that that'd be very helpful to ease out maybe some of these vast chasms that have existed between these talks.
Okay. So shall we wrap up that broadcasting of the YouTube and then go into the sort of a deeper discussion, more private discussion, or what do you suggest? Alex or Ariel, do you want to say more, something that you feel comfortable publicly anymore?
Yeah, I just one last comment again to reemphasize. I thought it was a very valuable conference and I got a lot out of it. And I think a lot of people would get a lot out of it, including people who I know are on the Zoom call who weren't at the conference. So I would recommend considering attending in the future. That's all.
Yeah,
thanks to the
audience. Exactly. I would want to add real quick that overall it was an incredibly nice crowd, and I know that the organizers put emphasis on that. It was very open-minded, and the discussions. It was a very open conference, very open-minded, very nice group of people. I had no sense of cliquishness or other things that can happen sometimes. So yeah, I totally agree with what Ariel said. Would encourage others to do so, and it was mentioned the time zone issues, and so there was an appeal that if the conference happens in person next year, that there will be maybe a virtual component as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, the inclusion of the time zone. Yeah, maybe they should do that. Maybe not in the same time day or period, but one conference between US Australia, Japan kind of time zone, and Asia, European kind of time zone, and so on to separate it, or maybe alternating it across years, right? Yeah. But anyway, that's great. Thank you, both of you, and we'll just stop then broadcasting here. Juin, do you want to stop, or should I stop it? Yeah, I'll just stop it.
Sorry, shall I start recording at the same time?